All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Dr. Fox. Welcome to CRPN Central Live, where we look at some of the most challenging parts of our industry with some of the most innovative minds that we have. Today, we're going to talk with Mitch Hilbe and Ellis Hiroki Butterfield, a little bit of a follow up on a previous recording that we had on data quality management. Everyone who listened to the podcast may have heard the introduction, but just so that we can refresh our memories, Ellis, how you doing?
Doing well. Is this the part where I introduce myself?
Sure, do it. Go for it.
My name is Ellis Hiroki. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called StudyOS. We're developing a real-time data quality uh, platform for sponsors currently. We hope to eventually have something that really empowers the rest of the industry to have high-quality data during research.
Yeah. And tell the audience something about yourself. What do you like to do for fun?
Oh man, that's putting me on the spot here, Dr. Fox. What do I do? Well, I mean, this is a really boring answer, but I do have two really cute cats, so I spend a lot of time uh, just toting on them.
No worries at all. Hey, cute cat photos are awesome. Probably one of the best YouTube watches. Anything online you see is cute cats. So, Mitch, how you doing?
Doing all right, man. I love the cat thing, by the way. I love it. I spent I don't have a cat, but we looked into it, and I spent like a whole week investigating these like catastrophic creations, and I knew I was gonna have to invest like thousands of dollars for cats to run all over my house. So that's part of why we don't have a cat. But yeah, thanks. Doing well. For those who don't know, Director ClinOps, Expanded Access, wide trial. Um, Several years as a CRA, lead CRA, and kind of got me to where I am now. But yeah, fun,
So,
fun story for this morning too. I definitely feel like I almost broke my leg just like an hour ago. Full on risky business style. Um, Sometimes the socks slide a little bit better than you think. And went sliding through the house and just like, sometimes there's also home gym equipment in the way and went right into the rower. So, but I thought it was great, and I wanted to share it because I thought it kind of almost blends really nicely with what we're talking about today and assessing risks and quality management. Because had I actually like taken the time to think about what I'm going to do and what the outcome probably is going to be, I might not have gone, risky
mhm.
business through the house.
And what's funny, Mitch, is odds are you went through that and you're never gonna do that again.
Oh, I
Maybe.
definitely will. Let's be yeah, I'm a giant child.
Well, so today it's a follow up. We're going to have a follow up on the podcast that we had. We talked about data quality management. I don't know how many of you have a shirt with a koala on it, but the koala tea joke is great for anyone who does data management, data quality. So, Mitch, senior CRA, Ellis, super duper innovative, StudyOS, AI. When you combine the two together, when you have the experience from the field with the experience in innovation and technology, how do you think that we can blend the two ideas together in the common practices that we heard from the podcast?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really great at the end of the podcast. If you make it that long, you really get that comparison of where Ellis and I kind of aligned. And throughout the whole thing, I know what I said and I know how I feel all the time, but listening to Ellis's remarks, and he and I haven't connected prior to this, so it was really great, and it was awesome how much we actually did align. So the same frustrations that I had from like the ClinOps side working in industry are like the same exact frustrations that it seems like Ellis has, and it's this realization of like, well, we need to do better, but the hurdle is always going to be, how do we actually do better, right? How do we
Mm-hmm.
initiate making it do better? How do we force better? My broken record this month is like ICHE8 and building a quality clinical trial and quality design. How do we make that a better process? I
Mm-hmm.
think Ellis wants to help with that too.
No, it's a really good question. I don't know if I have the best answer for it. I mean, I do think that one observation that I'm sure everyone makes, and we all talked about it, is just how much of this study is dependent on the upfront work that's being done. And so, a lot of times it seems like the industry moves from one siloed group to another siloed group. It's kind of like you're handing off like deliverables or sets of deliverables, and then they get altered. And, you start from the protocol, and then you get all these workbooks, and you get these like CRF guidelines. And so everything kind of stems from this initial document. But when you think about how many eyes were actually on the initial document in the first place, you realize that if people who were kind of building the database had contributed, if the sites had contributed, if maybe the monitors had contributed, you might have produced a document that was a little bit more robust and a little bit less prone to having some of the downstream issues that we all seem to notice. So I don't know. I mean, maybe the answer has nothing to do with technology. Maybe the answer has always been maybe if we take a step back and look at what we're doing, we might have better results.
This was always one of my questions. Is it feels like the same exact mistake in data quality management happens all the time. It's almost like we aren't learning our lessons. And that goes kind of to like what Hiroki was saying. The further upstream you go, the fewer problems you're going to have because you learn lessons, you change it, you make things better before they happen. Do we know why in the industry we're just not learning? Things just
I have one
aren't
comment about that before Mitch takes a step, just because I have a very recent example of something like this happening. It's kind of specific to capturing data, but when you're capturing like, let's say, a field value, right, and it's a computed value, right, so it depends on multiple other values. You should not ask the PI or the site to calculate that for you. Like, if you're like, I want the value C, and C is the sum of A and B, right? And then there's probably more instructions, like if A is this other thing, add this value. If B is this other thing, add this value. And then finally add C, and then you're capturing A, B, and C, right? You're like destined to fail because someone's going to interpret that incorrectly. Like, they're going to calculate A part wrong or the B part wrong, and then they're finally going to sum the C part wrong. And in general, if you can do the calculation on behalf of the site, do it. Don't ask them to do an extra calculation, because you're asking for bad data when it doesn't add any value, because you can always calculate those and make sure that the way that everything is calculated is homogeneous. And I was experiencing this somewhat recently, and it's funny because I was talking with a colleague of mine who was at a small oncology biotech, and he was talking about his experiences where they had the exact same problem. And this is just like a best practice. This isn't something where someone's like, it's novel to a therapeutic area. It's not novel to the kind of study you're doing. It's just in general, you shouldn't have a CRF like that. And I guess to answer your question, like, why do we keep repeating these things? I suspect there is just not that much material available, right? Like, if you're building out a database, or you're, a monitor looking for these kinds of issues, right? Like, where are you going to go to find common issues that occur, right? It's basically on the backs of experience, and no one really wants to talk too much about the very nitty-gritty details. At least that's been my impression. I only say that because if you're like a software developer in basically every other industry, like the sheer amount of material, they have the opposite problem where everyone has an opinion about how to do things, and it's just overwhelming, because then you're like, well, who's right? But I feel like in this space, it's the opposite, where there's basically no published opinions on how to do things properly, because I guess fear of reprimand, regulations, etc. And so then you're kind of left in the dark, and so everyone has to, reinvent the wheel, more or less, or make the same mistakes.
Yeah. So from a data capture standpoint, Ellis just perfectly described like BMI, age and date of birth, those things that can automatically be pulled. I do think, though, that part of the problem stems like historically. So when you look at like paper source versus electronic source and how we're capturing data, if you're writing it on a paper chart, the paper's not going to automatically calculate a BMI for someone. So they have to capture it in source. So then whatever's entered on paper source must be entered and accurate in EDC. So that's probably why this continues to occur. However, when we transition to direct data entry and electronic capture, electronic source, you're absolutely right. That should not be a barrier, should not be something anybody deals with. But it's really more that like transcription aspect. And transcription is like, I feel like 90% of the errors, at least, that we run into in the industry when it comes to queries. But
that's a good. So like EDC, for example, they have to cater to all the sites that are eSource and things like that, but they also have to cater to the sites that are also paper, which means they have to have those line items in there, because those paper source people, they're going to have to enter what is on their source document and just transcribe it into the EDC. So then you're pretty much just creating technology with like almost a vulnerability based off of what the site's processes are.
Yeah, it's very true. And then to speak to that process in general and why systemically, I think there's so many recurring issues. And you're talking, Dr. Fox, kind of how we start seeing the same things repeatedly, and they don't tend to get better. There's obviously a benefit from, you think, a ClinOps side, to have SOPs or have guidance documents as a standard guidance document on how you should put together a protocol, the structures of a protocol. The way I look at it a lot of times, it almost comes across as like a system like LegalZoom, where it's like you just kind of answer questions and plug and play, and then you get this lengthy worded document with really repetitive language, no matter who enters it, and only a couple key differences. I don't think that's great, though. I mean, there's a benefit in the sense of speed, but Ellis knows probably better than all of us here, when it comes to like UAT and actually testing systems or testing things, that aspect of like really testing a protocol, I mean, there is an element where it kind of does occur. It goes around a little round table or something, if you will, sometimes, but it's not quite as extensive, I think, in the industry for when it comes to like a protocol. But there are key stakeholders that do contribute to protocol design. And ideally, that's the practice that sponsors and CROs are going to try to take, is reach out to like your KOLs, your key physicians and PIs, and key CRCs, like a coordinator who's worked with the company before, worked on similar trials before, and then really has a solid understanding of assessments and the workflow and what it's going to look like on site and what those challenges are going to be. Hopefully that work is being done.
So Ellis, you had a really cool comment on the podcast, and that was yeah, you're like,
Did I?
yeah. So the oh shit comment, right? You did something recently, and a clinical operations person looked at that and said, "Oh shit," and that's a good thing. It means that they found something early. Without delving into the details, what kinds of oh shit opportunities does StudyOS help to identify in like a clinical trial?
That's a great question. I mean, I think primarily we look at a lot of the quantitative elements. So I think one of the big challenges that this folks have, especially on the smaller to mid-size, is you're not going to have a ton of people who are constantly looking at your data. And I think the norm, and I could be wrong here, but the norm, I feel like, is that a lot of the data cleaning processes are really pushed off towards data cuts. And so, you can think of any number of things you might catch at that point in time, like whether or not it's the, whether or not it's like patients are taking prohibited medications that you weren't really paying attention to, or maybe the scales look off, and maybe there's some kind of systemic data entry problem. A lot of these types of things don't get done until the very end of the study, and then you get to data cut, you're scrambling, unfortunately, or depending on whose perspective you're taking, extra monitoring credits will have to be, there's going to be a change order most likely, more site visits and so on. And so kind of everyone ends up scrambling. And the problem, I think, at the end of the day is, many times people don't have like these huge problems, and hopefully you can clean up everything. And, 1 or 2 months down the road, maybe you're just 1 or 2 months delayed. But I think the scarier outcome is when you find out that like a huge number of your patients maybe were not eligible because you weren't paying attention to that, or now your scales data are all incorrect and you have to go back to the PIs, and no one wants to submit data like that to the FDA. Going back to your earlier question though, like what specifically does it usually ends up being like things like, how is a primary endpoint being calculated or captured? Is it being calculated in like a way that looks, similar across all the sites? But I think the big one for us is IE. So a lot of the things that we do is we're looking at prohibited medication. And that's like a hard problem, I think, personally, because, let's say your protocol says like you can't take a certain class of drug, right? Well, that's really hard for people to capture whether or not a specific medication falls into a specific type of drug class. And so, or whether or not it has a certain property. So we have to do certain like kind of sophisticated things where we have to look at the name of the drug, and then we have to compare it to all existing drugs, or whether or not it's compounded, and then what are the active ingredients, and then from the active ingredients, which of those exhibit the properties that are put in the protocol. but that's not like a standard edit check. Like people don't really implement such levels of checking, and so what ends up happening, in my opinion, is there's like probably some medication that had some conflict that you weren't paying attention to, but it was probably more prevalent than you expected, and then suddenly like 10, 15, 20 folks are no longer eligible. And that's like actually the better circumstance. The worst circumstance is if that was a prohibited comment for safety reasons and you're missing that. And that would obviously be way more unfortunate. And, hopefully some other safety signals would catch issues like that. But I would say that that's probably where we end up finding a lot of errors.
So and Mitch, tell me what you think about this, but it almost sounds like something like StudyOS with that much power could empower a CRA to do their job very efficiently. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That said, also, realistically, tools are only as good as the people using them are going to be.
Yep.
So there's always going to be some sort of human element limitation there too. But yeah,
So
it sounds phenomenal, and I absolutely see value benefit there for sure.
I mean, I think regardless of something like my product or whatever else, I generally feel like monitors are being asked to do a lot of different things when they're on the site, and it doesn't really seem to me to make a whole lot of sense that monitors are expected to do what I would consider kind of like data crunching prior or on site, when really that should be provided to them before they even show up on the site. And I know that EDCs are not really the best at providing information in a way that's like consumable, right? Because you can look at individual participant records, but you definitely can't look at aggregate trends or summaries very easily, especially from the perspective that a CRA would need to look at it from. So I do think there's a bunch of opportunity for making sure that those visits can be much more streamlined. I mean, I know that central monitoring and remote CRAs are kind of a thing, but
Right.
It doesn't seem to be there doesn't seem to be consistent best practices on the interaction as far as I can tell. So
yeah, consistent best practices are always tough to push. As a lead CRA, that was one of the challenges as well. But I can say too, there are safety systems that we have, risk-based monitoring systems that are utilized, and CRAs have access to these. So you can go and look at like those scatter plots and find trends with your sites, find trends across the study, something that you may want to look for at your sites. And I think, what was even mentioned during the podcast too is, sometimes it's easily identifiable. You're like, oh yeah, we know that they both had two subjects that shouldn't have been consented right off the bat, and they only have 3 total subjects, so they're going to be really skewed. But there is that pre-work that really is expected to be done. That's almost a whole nother conversation when it comes to managing CRA time. CRAs historically used to be much more involved with hand-holding and have quality time on site to get through everything and really be a team player. And it's just continued to push further, especially during COVID and post-COVID, to where it's maximizing efficiency, if you will. But I think increasing time and how busy you are. Like, oh hey, you've got one day available at your home and office. Well, maybe instead you can go co-monitor with someone else over here. So instead of increasing staffing and maybe spending a little bit more, you're just increasing the workload on CRAs, which ultimately decreases the time that you can really invest in one particular site because you're spread so thin. And that speaks to burnout in the industry. There's such high turnover. It's not an easy job by any means.
Is that a resourcing problem primarily? Like you can't find enough monitors, or is it?
It's not that you can't find enough monitors, but it would be a resourcing problem for other aspects where maybe you don't want to pay for enough monitors.
And is that because the sponsor doesn't want to? Is that like, historically it was okay for them to have spent this much, but now competitive pressures are, forcing you to decrease the amount of time on site, or
with to the point with like COVID too, is when you start looking at monitoring and more from this like perspective of how can we maximize, like getting through check boxes, right? And so like trip reports become like check boxes as opposed to Word document narratives that we used to have to put together. And when you go to like checkboxes, how fast we can do these things, and let's get these reports turned around in like 2 to 3 days, and really trying to just make efficiency as much as possible when your efficiency is a focus on speed and deliverables, but that don't maintain that whole big picture. It's like, yeah, we want you to be able to look at all these things, but you're really trying to, like, in a sense, take away time. And, CRAs ask for more time. They ask for more support. And, as much as we want to be able to provide that from like an operations perspective, sometimes we kind of can't because it's a need that they have now, or, you get to like the end of the study that we were talking about, and biostats is finally running data, and we're finding these issues with data across all sites, and every CRA needs to be at their site like constantly. Well, if everyone's busy, who do you have to help support you, right? There's not just a bunch of CRAs sitting around doing nothing.
So Mitch, I got to ask you, how many sites does a CRA normally have under their wing to help?
Totally depends on the phase you're working on, kind of how you're located regionally, and really how much on-site time you need. Because there's some studies where it's like you could easily have 4 or 5 sites probably, but if you're only there every 3 months, then it's relatively manageable. But if you need to be on site for every 2 weeks because it's such a fast-paced study, then it's really going to cut back on, hey, you have 1 site or you got 2 sites at most.
Do they ever adjust CRA assignments by number of patients enrolled at each site? Like once enrollment's closed, they know enrollment, then they'll assess CRA load by that?
Absolutely. And not necessarily just patients enrolled, because I mean, sometimes you're getting through the data pretty quickly. So, if the way that I would have to look at that is if patients enrolled, say, you have a couple sites that are down like 30s, and then you have some sites that are 140 patients enrolled, but there's been, SWAT teams of CRAs being on site and they're 90% SCV'd. Well, they really don't have a whole lot of patient, load to handle. So it's not a direct like linear connection of how many patients this site has seen total versus more so how their data review progress is, because there might be a site with like 30 subjects and you only have 15% of the data reviewed. And then that site, for example, like 120 subjects, but you're 95% reviewed. There's a lot more to do at this much smaller site.
And go ahead, Ellis.
Oh, just speaking of data review, this is a little bit off topic, but in your experience, given kind of we were just alluding to how things changed during COVID and stuff, how has the monitoring process for you been when you compare going to a site that's paper first versus when you go to a site that's doing direct data capture? Like, how has that changed your workflows and your impressions of working with sites depending on their processes?
So direct data capture, I mean, if you get home office days, phenomenal. I mean, there's a lot of work that can be done in prep, and even remotely to review certain data points. So when you go on site to some of those that have the direct data review, then you're not really doing all that much, as long as it's accurately and acceptably defined in your monitoring plan, which is very important, because the monitoring plan kind of defines what you are and aren't allowed to do with the monitoring team. And it could be adjusted. Obviously, I could write an amendment to that. But when it comes to paper versus electronic, I don't know many CRAs that would choose electronic source over paper source. But from the site perspective, I can see both sides. Like, paper source is always nice and handy and easy, but doing it electronic or direct data entry prevents that. I mean, you're duplicating all your work. Then now you have to get in the system, and now you have to enter all your source. So you're just expanding how much time you have to spend on this trial. So it really is kind of a toss up.
So did I hear you correctly? You prefer to monitor paper, or were you saying the opposite? I'm not sure I heard.
I'm old school, so I love a paper chart.
Really
connects me to the patient more. I do. It's just, there's something about like kind of flipping through it, and then also when I'm home, I've got 3 screens and everything's phenomenal and I love it. But when I'm just working off like my small laptop and I'm on site and I'm logged into systems or trying to maybe work off of another system that they have, if they have a computer set up, for me to view source. And then I'm checking data on my, it's so much back and forth. Like the less windows I have to click back and forth on, the easier. And it's a lot easier for me to sit here and just kind of like flip like this, and then make a quick comparison between AEs and ConMeds and make sure everything is lined up, and then check to make sure that's accurate in EDC versus clicking back and forth between multiple windows and trying to check like the cross references and the links between adverse events and ConMeds. It's much more time consuming. So that's why I would prefer paper.
Got it. That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a whole other discussion in that, which is just, people there's a lot of conversation, I feel like, in this industry where it's very binary. It's like, is technology good or is technology bad? And I always find that conversation hilarious because, for one thing, people are always like, people totally discount how important having, a good user experience is with technology. So I don't think anyone's like looking at using their iPhone and going, oh man, is there like value in this technology? Like, would I replace this with a Nokia? I mean, maybe you would, I don't know actually, but the point I'm trying to make is it obviously plays a huge role in how much you're going to adopt the item, is how easy it is to use for whatever use case you have. And I think a lot of the products in this space, well, I'll just say it's like any other space where the buyer and the user are very different, right?
Yeah.
Any industry you go to where the buyer and the user are very different, you're going to have a lot of technology which makes the buyer's life easier, but it doesn't necessarily make anybody else's life easier. And then you get all the buyers going on stage and they're like, oh, well, I don't know about technology. We bought this thing. You bought this thing. And all of our, all of the people in our organization are not any more productive. Well, yeah, but I mean, did you ever ask them when you purchased the item whether it's good for them? I don't know. It just seems kind of a weird conversation to have. I always find that conversation very funny. It's like,
yeah, massive organizations, right? Yeah. Huge companies, especially when we see all these like mergers between like major CROs buying each other up, and then you're merging two different technologies and bringing people into other platforms and stuff, or sometimes going to all new platform. And the people who are testing it are such a small like subset of individuals who are just focused on this integration in tech and change, and not actually the people. You're not rolling it out generally to, oh, hey, let's send this out to test it with a few key people. It may be happening to a degree, but.
So I used to work at the post office a long time ago. And I mean, the post office had it down decades ago with OCR, right? Scan everything in, turn paper into electronic. It reads it. It knows what address to send things to. It had things figured out 2 decades ago. That was before AI was super duper huge. Do you see a world where, since, the industry loves paper, but we rely on technology, why can't we do something like an OCR AI, read the paper source and
100% could do it.
There's no convert it.
The FDA also like recently affirmed their position on certified source, right? Certified copies. It's like 100% technically feasible.
So what's the difference between that and someone entering paper source into the EDC?
Well, I think it's technically feasible. I'm not making any comments about whether or not people would adopt this actual process. I'm sure there's tons of reasons why this process would not be good. I just think it's technically feasible.
Yeah.
So you're gonna have to have someone check to make sure that it's correct, anyways, right? I mean, handwriting can be absolute garbage. If it's sitting in front of me, I might not have a clue what it says. That's how I feel about my own handwriting a lot of times too. So, I mean, that's not great Alcoa principles, right? It should be clear and legible. But if you develop AI enough and it's picking up, corrections and entering correct data where it's supposed to go, because you're scanning source docs and putting it into a system isn't new. I mean, that's been something that's been going on to allow remote monitoring for many years. But that AI intelligence reading those and capturing the data electronically from paper certainly seems feasible, but you still have to have some human element verifying that what the AI is capturing is correct.
Well, I mean, so you could turn it into an Alcoa standard, and let's say it reads everything and it spits out 40% that's questionable. You could set a threshold And then that could be, the human factor. You can still have eyes on something, but does it have to be 100%? Like, what if 75% of the threes are definitely accurate and we all know it's a 3? Why do you have to go and review all of those? Why not just let you focus on the problems?
Yeah, I mean that's fair. I mean, when you think of even SDR versus SDV, right? Source data review should always be 100%. Like as a monitor on site, you should always be looking at everything to make sure it's compliant. But what you have to verify in an EDC system doesn't necessarily align with everything that you're looking at. So you might only have to verify certain things based off, if you're doing a quality risk-based monitoring system. So
I don't know, man. It's tricky trying to get everyone to fall under the same system. I don't know if that's achievable because everyone, my wife, we're trying to do a bunch of billing right now, and she decided to change her LinkedIn profile to professional cat herder because that's kind of what it feels like right now. We're talking about cats again, right, Ellis? But sometimes it does feel like in this industry, you are literally a professional cat herder. There's no like organization around it at all. You just live in chaos and you just try to figure out how to work in chaos. Sometimes that's what it feels like when you're working in data quality management, because you're trying to get all these different people with all these different opinions, all these different processes, everything to somehow create the same exact product, which is data. So, I mean, from, like you said, trial by design, and from getting it up ahead of stream, having the processes in place, how can you find that balance? How can you figure out the balance to, like, everyone can agree to do this by one thing? I think that's what Alcoa was supposed to do, but I'm not sure if it worked.
Right. I mean, that's why we run into issues with Alcoa, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, what do you think? How can you create one system that everyone can agree to work with so that we can have more efficiency?
I mean, I'm going to jump in here. The answer is you don't. Like, there's never going to be a single system that ever does everything people want it to. I mean, that's like, it basically never happens unless it's a regulatory mandate. So I think if you want to push in that direction, like the answer would be, you get a bunch of people when you go to FDA and you go, hey, no, this has to be the way we do things. And then they have to make some kind of very, very clear and very strict mandate. But let's say that's not going to happen, right? Most other industries solve this by having developed, clear and well-documented interfaces. And what I mean by that is I have to be careful with my words here. So, for example, in most industries, software products will have something called an API, right? It's like an application programming interface, right? Not active pharmaceutical ingredient. And that is basically a data contract. It's like a contract that says if you fulfill the parameters of whatever, this other thing will happen, right? And so that way you can essentially have different systems that can integrate with one another without them having to have some more like financial agreement or anything else like that, right? I mean, this industry doesn't even provide those kinds of interfaces. So I feel like just as a start, people talk about interoperability, but most vendors are not even making that possible. I mean, we talk about that from experience. Like, EDC should not charge money for API integrations. That's ridiculous. Like, you already have an export feature. It is like you are preventing any kind of innovation on the site side, direct data capture into EDC, because you do not publish free APIs. It's ridiculous. But I guess to answer your question, like, that's probably like, you need to have interfaces that people agree on, but people have to be incentivized to actually publish and create those interfaces to begin with. So,
yeah, I would agree. That's a challenge we face with the expanded access industry, and something we work on trying to improve and always talking about is finding quality like APIs, far and few between for sure, and how we can kind of merge those different aspects and to make it a simplified, true single sign-on system where you're not, necessarily single sign-on here and then it just links you to other websites, or other platforms. It's just a single sign-on. You're capturing your data here. All your stuff is maintained here, and then that API is, automatically like migrating that data. But I'm not a computer guy. I had to watch like 50 hours of API videos earlier this year. So
it's So you were talking about an incentive, Ellis, to do these kind of interface contracts, interface agreements, things like that. You said one incentive might just be a mandate from the governing body. Hey, you have to do it this way if you want to do business. It's kind of like, the directive. My guess is there's probably some other form of incentive, like there's money. Of course, money could also be a disincentive for
Right.
innovation, like what you were talking about with the EDCs. We kind of know this industry. What do we think would be like the incentives to try to get this kind of relationship for data quality management, so we can all kind of get on the same page? Paper, electronic, technology, just trying to get to a system where we can all work into an efficient manner.
That is a very, very good question. I will say that this industry is unusual in particular because of the way that, the sponsor purchases a lot of the platforms that end up being used by other stakeholders. And so, it's not going to have the same kind of dynamics as other industries. But like, why does every single, marketing automation tool try to integrate with Salesforce, right? They all do it because, they understand that their buyers are going to purchase Salesforce first for the CRM. And they know that by having an integration, they're reducing friction of adoption, right, for their product, right? So there's like this gorilla, and they're trying to piggyback off of that, right? The thing is, the data is produced by the sites, not the sponsors. And so even if metadata or some other EDC is the quote unquote gorilla, it's not like the sites themselves benefit at all from having some kind of financial relationship with metadata. So I don't know. In that sense, I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't know. That analogy falls short, and I'm not sure what the answer is. If I knew, that would be great.
No, that's a really, really good point, actually. Is a lot of these people, Salesforce was a perfect example. QuickBooks does it too. A lot of the things that have pretty much established themselves as a household name that everyone just depends on as a staple for their businesses, it's a lot easier to follow their lead, and you're probably going to get a return on investment just by associating yourself with these organizations, which that's kind of like your incentive to fall in line. In this industry, as you were saying, I'm not sure if we know who to fall in line with yet. I think that there's still a lot of push and pull between all of these different vendors, things like that, where nobody quite knows what the standard is.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, if I weren't doing what I'm doing now, one of the things I would probably try to do is build an Outlook, like an Outlook extension that handles some portion of the, study startup process, just because I feel like everyone would adopt it. It's like, oh yeah, everyone uses Excel, or sorry, not Excel, Outlook. Everyone uses Outlook. It's like pretty much built into their workflows. And like, if you can prove to everyone, because like, I think at the end of the day, if you're going for a model where you're trying to improve sites, for example, it's like a distribution game. You just want to have as many sites using your product as possible, as low friction as possible, and then you can like add on other features, and you can slowly get them to adopt more and more things. I feel like the problem is you can't have this like change order management is really hard, right? You can't just tell a site like we're paper today, tomorrow we're eSource, good luck, right? Like that's a fundamentally different way of working. But what's not fundamentally different is email. Everyone uses it. Everyone kind of hates it. It's a place where there's a lot of flexibility. That's where I would start. But that's not what we do right now. So
get people off of their email boxes,
or just email is such a beginning and end of so many workflows that you could definitely add a lot of value to many different people very quickly in that regard. I'm not sure how that relates to the original question. I think I'm just going off on a tangent at this point, but I think there's a lot you could do there.
So Mitch,
Kelvin
question to you.
Go ahead. A great point. Sorry, I want to address Kelvin's point about working with like a preferred central IRB versus your local IRB. Local IRBs, a lot of times you have like required regulations. So that is your go-to. Like if you're part of a university or institute, you have that local IRB and you are required to work with them. However, in order for those processes to take place to allow you to work with the central IRB, you have to have the local IRB has to give that permission to allow, like defer. It's a deferral statement where they defer to the central IRB to allow you to work with the central IRB in that instance.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really interesting really interesting statement, kind of like trying to force you to work with a central IRB. Just don't work with them.
Yeah, I mean, it gets tricky. Most of the time, local IRBs are reserved for universities, academia, investigator-initiated studies. Anytime in industry anymore, we pretty much go central. And it's because it's a multi-center global trial. It only makes sense to have a larger IRB entity to oversee it. If you had all of these locals and assume they don't talk to each other, then you could have a problem.
It's very true. What was your question? Sorry.
The question, the same one with Ellis is, like, what is the magic bullet? How in the world can we get everyone on somewhat of at least a neutral ground so we can all kind of be innovative and still be a little more synergistic?
I don't think there's a silver bullet. I mean, I guess if I would have to say one, it's building in better transparency, communication, and like a trust center almost, if you will, with the whole design process, because that's where the struggles are, right? Like, we know that, sponsors are the ones that are, or designated CRO are the ones that are electing to use certain platforms. And they're the ones that select these platforms that the sites then have to use. The sites don't get to choose what data they are specifically capturing. That has to be kind of controlled by the study design and the sponsor. The sponsor is the one that has to speak to the FDA and represent the data and the drug to the FDA, right? So they're the ones that have to come up with, this is what we need, this is why we need it. Here's our safety data, this is why we need it. They're the ones that report on it. We need the sites to be able to collect all this. So there's not, I mean, it kind of sounds weird to say, but there really can't be like almost a middle ground there outside of just that early collaboration and partnership with stakeholders at the site levels.
I feel like there's other things that can be done. I'm just going to add there. So for example, let's say you're creating a database for the study, right? And you need to collect however many fields are associated in the CRF, right? And have you guys ever seen like the Rave Architect loader where it's like the Excel sheet and has all the different field values and their data types? Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
No.
Okay, so it doesn't really matter. The point I'm trying to make is this, right? There's definitely things that the database design, like in that database design, that could be prepared to make sites' lives easier. For example, instead of producing PDFs, you could also produce like an actual structured document that's like, these are all the fields that are being captured and these are all the data types, right? And these are all like the range values, like edit checks, whatever. And I get that, like the timing, sometimes these don't get finished in time and whatever else. I totally get that. But even like a structured document like this could then be handed over to something like an e-source vendor where they can then use that to generate the templates that are being used. Or, I mean, someone could make even a plugin for Word that takes that template and then helps automatically build all your paper source, and then you can add all the extra fields that you're talking about. Like, there's a lot of things where if you create understandable and clear documented interfaces, and when I say documented interfaces, I mean like this is like this is a challenge for me because there's a lot of terms that this industry uses and other industry uses that don't mean the same thing. But you could create, in effect, a protocol, not a clinical protocol, but a protocol that basically, dictates how the interface of like data from, some other system to an EDC works, which is like an API. You can have these kinds of things, and they can then be taken up by other vendors and say, oh, like if I can always understand or trust that the data is going to come in this way from the database, I can then generate source document templates, or I can generate the e-source templates or whatever else. So there's like stuff that could be done there that would definitely reduce a lot of friction. Are you referring to relational database management system? And RDBMS is just a longer version of like what the word database, like every database that like people use. Okay, so in this industry, people use the word EDC as like interchangeably with database, and EDC is like a form builder on top of a database. And database systems are like things like SQL Server or Oracle or Teradata or a bunch of other things. So I guess yes and no. Not quite sure if I'm answering your question, Kelvin. Sorry.
So I have a follow-up, and this is something that it's actually boggled my mind ever since Ellis said it. But Mitch, do you know why they write protocols with crazy footnotes and appendices? Why can't they make a protocol linear? Do we know? why
be
it's so
more clear?
like it's written like they're gonna submit it to a publication, to an article or a journal?
So footnotes, I mean, I think where you see most of the footnotes in a protocol is going to probably be that schedule of assessments. And you've got A through J for footnotes. Footnotes should generally be describing like an exception to a rule, like an if then kind of relationship is how most footnotes you'll find are, right? Um, or maybe a footnote describing, hey, this is an order of operations, and that order of operations when it comes to research or generally in medical practice as itself, it should be like least invasive to most invasive. So when you talk about like screening procedures and, okay, here's all the things that need to be done, here's your checklist, you might have a footnote to just clarify, hey, do height, weight, BMI, do blood pressure, do all these other things before you do a blood draw. Get an EKG before you get a blood draw, because you want to be, if a subject's going to screen fail, then you want them to screen fail from the least invasive before they get to the more invasive procedures where you're, sticking a needle in their arm to draw blood.
But yeah. I mean, and I've seen SOE, but also it gets really tricky because some people, especially like finance people, they look at the SOE and they're done with it. So we've seen some situations where, you don't read the whole protocol. You only look at the SOE. And then all of a sudden, let's say you get a coverage analysis ordered. And that coverage analysis identifies this random lab test that was in section 7B that nobody ever looked at, or a negative result that was over here, or something that was just embedded somewhere in the protocol that was not comprehensive to the SOE. And so therefore there was a deviation. Something happened because whoever built that SOE didn't read the entire protocol. So that's where, I mean, even talk about standardization. Is there any way, shape, or form you can actually create a standard protocol format so that people can at least know how to read it properly?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the point I touched on earlier. There really are, like, at least everyone should have some standard template of how you're formatting these. When it comes to your schedule of events or assessments that you need to do, it's going to be dictated by the trial. Your order should be, like I said, least invasive to most invasive. And then the bigger part, I think, for me, that varies greatly, depending on study, might be kind of those windows that you're allowing based off of what you're particularly assessing. If you're assessing, placebo effects or whatever, and like pain drugs, or if it's just a heavy menstrual bleeding trial, is very different safety aspects and timing that's so sensitive, and something like a pain trial versus the timing.
So it's hard to put every indication into a single protocol format because every trial has got to test different things. And
we can sure try, but I mean, it's going to be a constant growing database too, because every trial should be, unique to a degree. We're innovating in this space, so we shouldn't just be repeating the same thing over and over again. What would be the significant value if every trial was exactly the same? So there should be differences in kind of what we're looking for to a degree, but I definitely see where there's elements that are going to be the same, that should be the same. Certain markers are the same.
I mean, what do you think, Ellis? I mean, this was your comment, and I've been thinking about it all week.
I think that, well, there's a couple of things. I think that there is a structured form of a protocol that could be created that is not the PDF that everyone's associated with or that everyone's familiar with. There are companies who are working on kind of a more structured protocol design. I guess the way I would almost tie that together is like, you see, I'm trying to think of a good way of putting this. I always have this trouble with describing like the difference between structured and unstructured data to folks, or semi-structured data to folks who aren't like super familiar with writing code. But like how you can change like the colors, or like you can change how things look on your phone or a bunch of other things, but fundamentally nothing in the phone actually changes. It's just like a UI thing, right? It's just like how you see something and the data underlying that can change independently from one another, right? So you can have a bunch of different, you can have something look one way, but then the data underneath. I suspect that there's like a form where the protocol information has like a layer of data underneath, and then the way it's shown to you is different. And the reason I'm saying that is for my other point, which is different representations matter to different people. And so there's often this belief that there's like the one way to show a person how to do something, or like the one way the protocol should look. And I'm not even sure I buy that. For example, like there's a reason that when you have an EDC, right, there's like a site view, and there's a data manager view, and then there's like a sponsor view, right? These different views, the data is exactly the same. Like none of the data is different, but you have different views, right? Because different people need to see different things. Just going to comment on Kelvin's. Yes, structure data is not just like the data type, which is what you're referring to, but it's also kind of the way that you actually structured object not defined. Kind of. Okay, so structured is something like, I'm just going to quickly go on a tangent. So structured is basically like when the structure of the data is known from the data types to the way that it's represented. So for example, like you can think of like a CSV as something that's more structured. Semi-structured would be something like a Word document where there's like loose structure, but it's not consistent among applications. And then unstructured is like an image, right? That's just like binary data. It's like ones and zeros. So anyway, that's like way too in the weeds. My point is just this, right? Like one, I do believe that there is a form of the protocol that can be written that is a step below like the PDF that everyone uses, right? And then from there, you can have different views. Like you could imagine like the site finance view of the protocol. It's only the information that they need to do their job. You can imagine that there's a CRA version of the protocol, which is the view of the protocol that the CRAs need. There's the one for the PI, right? Because at the end of the day, like right now, it's basically written from the perspective of like the academic literature, the academic medical writer, right? Like that's how it's been, that's how it was born. Totally makes sense. But when you're trying to scale this kind of this view, like if you're trying to take the medical writer view of the world, but then make every single person subscribe to that view, Of course, there's going to be a lot of challenges.
So it's almost like data view permissions based off of role.
Kind of, yeah. That's a great way to think about it.
So you kind of have like a master, like everything, and then the filter based off of what the role is.
Right.
So like,
and then
for example, if you're like a PI who's also the business owner, your PI is going to have to see the finance stuff.
Right, and so you have this if you have this underlying protocol structure, then presumably you can create any of these other kinds of views, and it could be linear. For example, there could be a linear view where everything is just, in sequential order based off of when it happens. So,
well, I did want to go up to Kelvin's question. Kelvin, this is a long story, and I don't know if any of you have ever had to negotiate a budget for a trial, but this is a big challenge. How do you ensure footnote considerations are implemented in a budget? I'll tell you what, Kelvin, it is a huge process. And just so you know, and you guys might love this, but very few people who negotiate contracts at the site get the protocol. Very rarely do we get the protocol. We get an Excel spreadsheet from the contract specialist over at the CRO that says, here's the budget, negotiate. We have to go to our internal ops team to say, hey, do you have the protocol? I'm doing this budget. We're never sent the protocol. So to answer your question, Kelvin, you have to do this comparator where you look at the Excel spreadsheet that the CRO gives you, and then you have to get the protocol that you asked for. You have to compare the schedule of assessments, and then at the very end, you read the entire protocol and make sure that everything is covered in both the schedule of assessments, the Excel spreadsheet, and the entire read. I can't tell you how many times I've had to negotiate trials where there's like a pregnancy test, or there's some local lab built into the protocol, built into the schedule of assessments that is not built into that Excel spreadsheet that the CRA gave, or the contract specialist gave me. So you have to navigate those 3 documents to make sure that your site is fully protected in the budget for all of the services that you're promising to perform. In a nutshell.
They just don't send you the protocol, or is that like a permissions?
Nobody, unless you are fortunately copied on the email from your coordinator who referred you over to the budget. Because sometimes what they'll do is they'll include the budget with the protocol in the award letter to the CRC, which, by the way, is another really big problem. Because very rarely do independent sites want CRCs to see the budget, because they'll see like these really big numbers, and then they'll demand a raise, and they don't see all these other expenses on the back end of a site. You don't have, I can't think of an analogy, some other business where you've got a frontline worker, a nurse. A nurse doesn't see the bill that goes to the patient, right? The nurse does the job and the nurse gets a paycheck, but the nurse doesn't see the back and forth for that. So again, the site
let me
admins.
jump in a little bit on that too. From like a monitoring perspective, that is insanely frustrating for us as well when you're going out to like qualify sites and everything also. And Kelvin, WTFs are totally fine. Just ask Ellis.
By the way, we got an F-bomb winner here, the first F-bomb of CRP and Central, right? So
right.
All good. It's all good, Kelvin.
So
I agree.
The frustrations are like, okay, logically, it should be A, B, C, D, E. We should have certain things in place before we continue to move on. But startup has become so rushed, so fast that we're trying to get sites and contracts and budgets taken care of. Well, I say we, not me, because I wouldn't want to do it that way. But the CROs and sponsors want to get these sites contracts and budgets and everything worked out. Oftentimes before there is even a final protocol version that we're working from. So it might not exist. And that's exactly what Fox would run into all the time because it doesn't exist. So how can you give it to someone if there's not a final protocol?
So now if you really think about that legally, you're signing a contract agreeing to do something that you don't know. Hey, we want you to do this for us, but could you go ahead and sign this contract? We'll let you know what it is later. Sorry. That just seems absolutely insane to me.
There's always this like frustration between sites. It's like, well, no, like I need more information, or you're requesting these documents, you're requesting more. And it's easier, if the study's already up and running and then they're bringing you on as a site, great. But it's good for you. But if they got you early, you're an early adopter, you're one of the first sites up, then you're going to probably face a lot of those struggles with many, many CROs, the big ones for sure. And
before you know it, it's going to be, okay, 2027, someone's going to approach me now today. Say, tell you what, we got a protocol in 2027. We haven't written it yet, but we want to go ahead and lock you in on a budget. Can we do that? Well,
yeah.
I don't know what it's going to be. It might be an oncology study, sample study,
it's a post office thing, Vox. It's like forever stamps.
Jeez.
It's just one life. You're good forever.
So go ahead and comment on that, Ellis, for me, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap it up.
Comment on the budgeting into the future.
Well, that might be a little extreme, but I mean the idea. So going back to what Kelvin was saying, do you see a future in tech where you could actually create some system where, and you're probably gonna say yes because you're a genius, but can you take a protocol and somehow mingle that experience where the Excel spreadsheet, like what site administrators are sent versus what the protocol sent versus everything else, it aligns, and you're not really missing things between the silos of the CRO being the ClinOps versus finance. Somehow services are missed in the budget, things like that. How can you link
like all
that?
things, like things I've said before? Most problems are not technical problems. Most problems are people problems. It's not that you couldn't create a system like that. I mean, hell, my team could probably do it in a couple months if that was the only thing we were doing. The challenge becomes, well, who's going to buy that? Every single stakeholder has to more or less agree to that process. How many other systems you have to integrate with? It's quite challenging, I think, in that regard. If I were to guess what stakeholder could conceivably do that, probably a larger CRO could probably do that end to end if they really wanted to. Right, start with the program. The other way to approach it is, again, you figure out all the different steps along the way, and then you kind of evangelize a template or a standard process, and then you go and say, this is how we think the industry should do it. And you can build a lot of technology around that kind of standard method, template, interface, whatever you want to call it. I'll give you an example. For example, that and I know we only have a minute, but
no, you're fine.
Let's take finance, for example, right? You could conceivably go and say, this is the industry leading budget template, right? This is how we think every site should do it, right? And then, sure, it's not going to work 100% of the time, but But you go and you evangelize this and say, this is what we believe is the new way to do it. This is going to have so much cost savings as everyone can agree to. And not everyone will, and that doesn't matter. But what you do is you say, you go onto market and you're like, okay, well, look, all these, we have 100 different sites or maybe like 20 CROs all using this specific template. And then you go work with some vendors and you're like, okay, like 80% of the time, this template's going to be used. So build technology around it. So specifically, as long as this template's being used, automatic integration with QuickBooks, something like that, right? And so then the 20% are like, oh man, I don't want to use this template, but now I get this QuickBooks integration if I do it. So then they follow along and stuff like that. And that didn't require any one specific person to say, like, look, I'm going to go. I mean, that's kind of like the whole Transcelerate model-ish, except I don't think they execute on that well. But like, you can be a quote-unquote organizational thought leader, push specific ideas or templates. The problem with them is that they're like way too high level. They'll have like a 50-page best practices document that no one's going to read, and it's too complex, and you still need a team of 100 people, and it assumes everything's done manually. So maybe not like that, but you kind of get the general gist of what I'm saying.
All right. Well, we're at the hour, folks. That's a really awesome conversation. Let's wrap it up real quick. Let's start with Ellis.
Thank you for having me. It was great. I don't know what I should say here. If you are a small to mid-sized biopharma or CRO, please consider chatting with me about StudyOS and see how we might help prevent systemic data failures that happen during the course of a study.
Yep, I agree. I want to learn more about StudyOS too, Ellis, and maybe we can talk about that offline. Mitch, would you like to wrap up?
If you are a small or mid-sized biopharma, please connect with Ellis. Thanks, Dr. Fox, for having us. It was great to do this wrap up. I'm excited to see more of the CRPN lives, and it was phenomenal. It's a pleasure talking with you too, Ellis.
Pleasure talking with you as well.
Yeah. So just for all of you watching, whether now or later, this was the very first CRPN Central live event with our podcast interviewees. Thank you so much for being part of history. I'll just let you know that my calendar is very full. So if you pay attention to CRPN Central and you see all of the people that we've interviewed in 2023, expect to see a lot of them on this live event in the next few months. It's going to be a very, very exciting time. In the meantime, the YouTube channel is up and running, doing great. Little shorts. If you have any questions that you want in a little short, if you want to be part of it, if you want to have a discussion, anything that you need, that's what CRPN is here to do. Importantly, CRPN is free to join for sites. It's very affordable for consulting. And my dedication is to make sure that sponsors save a ton of time and money when they do clinical research trials through the CRPN network. I've already got the data are starting to come in. I'm working on my first white paper. I've got results for the sites. Going to be a very exciting year. So on that note, thanks for everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Like and subscribe.
Bye.